Hello everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Zulkhairi. Today I would like to share with you about my study, which is Understanding Human Responses to Wildlife in Malaysia. Before I start, I would like to introduce you to my paranymphs. On my right side is Arjaan Pellis, and on my left side is Maurice Paulissen. In the next 10 to 13 minutes or so, I will explain to you the relevance and also the needs of my study, and also I will show to you the scientific approach that I use to address this topic. I will then present to you the results and also the implication of my study. Okay, so why we need to understand human responses to wildlife? Why this study? It is because humans are diverse in their thought. One group of people may demand wildlife to be protected from humans. The other group of people may demand people and their property to be protected from wildlife. So the differences in thought can be attributed to different factors such as values and emotion, if you look from the psychological perspective. And if we try to find information on how different people react to different animal issues, there are tons of it out there. But then most of the scientific reports and studies are about Western society. And if you look into research that have been conducted in Malaysia, the studies either confined to specific species or context or about particular mental process. So I tried to fill the gaps by investigating different and multiple human responses to wildlife, and also integrating different concepts, in particular cognition and emotion, to better understand human-wildlife relationship. For that, this study aims to understand and explain how Malaysians think about and respond to wildlife issues, wildlife policy and management plans. I designed a conceptual framework that guide my study. There are concepts that reflect cognition, which are the domination and mutualism wildlife value orientations. Dominations reflect a view of which humans' welfare are more important than wildlife protection, while mutualism is a view that emphasizes the equality of protection between humans and wildlife. There is also a concept that reflects emotion, which is valence towards wildlife. Valence is a pleasant, unpleasant dimensions of emotion. I also integrate a concept that constitutes both cognition and emotion, except on different level of abstraction, which is wildlife risk perception. I theorize the three factors could explain acceptability of wildlife management actions, and also support for conservation policy. I further design 4 research questions, of which I will explain to you what I did, how I did it, and what I found. My first research question concerned about the applicability of wildlife value orientation measures in Malaysia. The measures were already developed, but based on Western culture, which are different than the Malaysian culture. Although literature indicated the usefulness of the wildlife value orientations to explain different kind of animal issues, attitudes, and norms, but then the same effect is still unknown among Malaysians. So I tried to explore this by conducting a pilot survey among a sample of university students. I collected 271 questionnaires back, and I estimated the reliability and validity of the measures by conducting several statistical analyses. And what I found that the wildlife value orientation measures are applicable in the aspect of its reliability and validity and can be used within the Malaysian society. But how I reached to this conclusion, let me share with you two technical information. The first one, the measures' reliability were estimated using Cronbach alpha. Because the domination and mutualism Cronbach alpha scores exceeded the generally accepted threshold of 0.65, so I concluded that the measures were reliable. Secondly, both domination and mutualism were identified as a factor that could explain acceptability of lethal control among the study sample, matched with theoretical assertion and previous findings. So based on these two evidence, I concluded that the wildlife value orientations are applicable. So what's next? The measures were reliable and valid enough, but then we don't know for sure whether the scope of the measures cover salient thought about wildlife amongst Malaysians. Following the first study, I conducted semi-structured interviews among 30 inhabitants who live in Peninsular Malaysia with different demographic background. This time I used an interview approach because it will allow me to do an in-depth analysis to explore salient thought. And the questions that I asked them is, what first comes into their mind when they think about wildlife? How do they think humans and wildlife are related? And how people should treat wildlife? Based on their responses to this question, I analyzed the data using content analysis approach, and I found that there are 6 themes identified reflecting salient thought about wildlife. And as you can see on the screen, I further clustered the themes into categories, and to some extent, on the abstract level, the themes and categories reflected the domination and mutualism wildlife value orientations. In addition to that, most of the statements expressed by interviewees are very similar to the items of wildlife value orientations. So based on these findings, I concluded that the scope of the skills, the scope of the measures cover salient thought about wildlife amongst Malaysians, and I decided not to amend the questionnaires that I will be used in the next step of my study. Earlier in my presentation, I mentioned about one scientific contribution, of which the integration of cognition and emotion to better understand human-wildlife relationship. So I tried to explore this inquiry in the third research question, of which I want to see what is explained by cognition and what is explained by emotion, or how these two factors could contribute to a better understanding of human-wildlife relationship. So what I did right now is, for this research question, I conducted a survey among inhabitants who live in areas with frequent human-wildlife interactions, and I estimated the influence of cognition and emotion on public acceptability of lethal control and also support for conservation policy. And here are the results presented as table 4.2 in page 52 of my thesis, if you want to have a look into the book. I simplified the tables into figures with the intention to make it more understandable. You can see figures with different shapes and colors represent different concepts. And inside the green and blue shapes, there are beta index. So in principle, the larger the beta index, the better it is, because it indicates a better relationships between the independent and dependent variables. So we want to see a larger beta index. In the current figures, you can see that both domination and mutualism, concepts that reflect cognition, could explain public responses to the two wildlife issues. In other words, I can say that if we understand people's basic thought about wildlife, we could understand how they will respond to these two wildlife issues. Then I add valence into the analysis model, and right now what I see, support for wildlife conservation policy was better explained when valence was included. Not only that, what is explained by mutualism significantly decreased when valence included. In layman terms, I can say that if we understand people's feelings toward wildlife, we could better understand the degree of support they can give to wildlife conservation policy. Not only that, Valence did not add anything next to cognition to explain public acceptability of lethal control, but independently could explain the public acceptability on this issue. So I concluded that research that integrate both cognition and emotion to understand human responses to wildlife will be better rather than research that relying either on cognition or emotion alone. Finally, I want to test my full model. So in this research question, I tried to predict the extent of prediction that can be made by wildlife value orientations, valence towards wildlife, and wildlife risk perception on public acceptability of 3 different wildlife management actions. So the 3 different management actions implies different degree of consequences to wildlife. And also to have a broader understanding of public responses, the extent of prediction were estimated in 3 different scenarios. And here are the results presented in page 76 of my thesis. It is actually the same figures of my conceptual framework, except we are looking from different angle. And if you look closely, the arrows represent the identified relationships between the independent, mediating, and dependent variables. And if you look closely, there is actually one identical pattern, which is domination is the superior predictor, because this factor was identified could explain public acceptability on different management interventions and in all situations. In other words, I can say that people who are more domination-oriented is more likely to accept management interventions that will benefit them. The second most important factor is mutualism, followed by risk perception. And valence did not have direct influence on public acceptability, but indirectly would explain acceptability of doing nothing through risk perception. So in other words, I can say that the more people feel unpleasant towards wildlife, the more they will perceive wildlife as risky, and the more likely for them to not accept doing nothing as management actions. These are all of my answers to each research question. I like to repeat back all my answers. For the first one, yes, the wildlife value orientation measures are applicable in the aspect of its reliability and validity and can be used in Malaysia. Second, there are 6 themes identified reflecting salient thought about wildlife amongst Malaysians, although it is not one-to-one similarity, but then on the abstract level, the themes and categories reflected the domination and mutualism wildlife value orientations. For the third one, valence add or help to improve our understanding of human responses next to cognition, and valence also independently could explain acceptability of lethal control. And finally, domination is the most useful factor because this factor were identified as a factor that can explain public acceptability on different type of management interventions and in different situations. So, in understanding human responses to wildlife, I think we gain new insight. First of all, as I repeatedly say, overall, the results, they are meaningful patterns. The first one, the influence, the usefulness of domination value orientations, because this factor was found to be very important to explain public acceptability on different kind of management interventions in all situations. Not only in terms of relationships, the degree of influence also are bigger than the degree of influence than the other factors. Second, if you look into the importance of emotion, we can see that emotion drives support for conservation, while cognition drives responses to management actions. I may be exaggerate in my interpretation here, but then I can say that if our feelings may lead to good things or positive things to wildlife, while our thinking may lead to bad things or negative things to wildlife. And finally, I like to point out that the pattern of relationships in my data were found to be different than the pattern of relationships found in Western studies. So it seems like how non-Western people react or respond to wildlife issues are different than the Western people, whether it is because of ideology or religions or socioeconomic, demographic, geography. We don't know for sure, but then this study has become an important avenue for cross-cultural examination to better understand human responses to wildlife. Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and for listening. I think I still have a couple more minutes, and let's see what happens.
Please be seated. I hereby open the ceremony convened by the Academic Board of Wageningen University, in which Zulkhairi Azizi Zainal Abidin is offered the opportunity of defending a thesis with propositions entitled Understanding Human Responses to Wildlife in Malaysia. The event will take place before an examining committee appointed by the Academic Board as a prerequisite for conferring the degree of doctor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you all to this graduation ceremony. My name is Paul Struik. I'm Professor of Crop Physiology at Wageningen University, and I'm representing the Academic Board and Director Magnificus this morning. I'd also like to welcome our 4 examiners, and especially Professor Haartsen, who came all the way from Groningen, and Dr. Edans, who is replacing Dr. Wells on a very short notice. Thank you very much for being here. And now call on the first examiner, Professor Arts. Professor Arts is professor at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group here in Wageningen. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Respected candidates, first of all, I would like to congratulate you with completing your thesis. I read it with great interest. As you know, our group, Forest and Nature Conservation Policy, also conducts research on wildlife value orientations, although from different perspectives. I come back to that later. And another compliment is that I also very much like that you in chapter 6 are very brave in the sense that you repeat your research questions and give a very brief and clear answer. So most PhDs are not so brave, and then really you have to look for answers to questions, but you were brief and very clear. Okay, still I would like to discuss with you the answer to the first question about the following. Are the wildlife value orientation scales applicable in Malaysia? And you say, yes, very clear. The scales have acceptable reliability and predictive potential and could therefore be applied in Malaysia. You say acceptable. I have my doubts. So I have a few questions about that. So my first question to you is, can you again explain this acceptability? Because if I look at reliabilities, particularly internal reliability, the consistency of your scale and items, and in terms of validity is only one aspect, predictive validity, nothing about construct validity, for example. And I come back to that later. And also the R square is not that high. So again, why it's acceptable to you?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Indeed, before I started, I also have these doubts whether the measure is applicable or not. But then I stand firm with my conclusion that the wildlife value orientation measures are applicable in Malaysia because of several factors. The first one, if you look into the statistical figures, it is clear that from the aspect, it is exceeded the generally accepted threshold of 0.65. And if we try to look into the meanings of it, so it shows that people could understand the questions and it could reflect their salient thought about wildlife. Okay. But then looking back on your question about how it could explain acceptability, of which I also received the same questions from the reviewers, of which I submitted the manuscript for. So one of the questions is why the R square is very low, is very minimal. Is it because of, not very, but then I would say like slightly low, slightly minimal. So is it because of it is not an important issue? So probably it is because of the student sample. So the issues of wildlife issues probably is not salient for them at that time. So it's just a matter, I think it is kind of like trade-off. In pilot survey, I can do my study whether among public sample or student sample, but because of time limitation, and I think it's better for me to start as soon as possible and to see how much it could give me a bit of basis to continue my study. So it gives me an idea to start with the student sample. From there, I can see that, okay, there is a sufficient reliability and also validity, except in terms of acceptability, as I mentioned, and also with the concern of the reviewer, probably the issue is not that salient among them. And that's how I come to the ideas to find a different study sample in the next step of my study.
Okay.
That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy that the reviewer of your paper posed the same question as I did. At least it's not a stupid question, right? Okay. For the next question, I would like to ask one of the paranymphs to read out proposition 1.
The domination orientation to wildlife is hard to measure, yet explains a lot about Malaysians.
Can you explain that second part in one sentence? What does it explain about Malaysians? Not too long answer, please.
Domination could explain how people react to different wildlife issues, wildlife-related issues. That's my answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, very brief and very clear. Still, I have a question on construct validity. So the concepts you used and how you operationalized it. And the concept is a wildlife value orientation. And you use a very simple scale, so domination and mutualism, while in the literature on this kind of issues, nature values, wildlife values, you also have scales which are much more subtle, so to speak, that you also have categories between domination and mutualism. And if you read the literature, you find those scales. Why you use this scale and not a more, I would say, more developed scale, which gives you much more, I would say, or at least the potential of finding more subtle answers, how people relate to wildlife and how they behave towards wildlife.
Okay, that's a very nice and interesting question. For me, these questions have become one of my ideas on how can I continue with this study, study on this topic. It is because, well, just like my answer to your first question, it is just a matter of decision. I cannot do everything. I cannot do anything at one time, because one of the main ideas, one of the main contribution of the studies is to see the importance of cognition and emotions, how these two factors could contribute to a better understanding. So if we look from the practical point of view, having these two concepts and also with different kind of measures that I decided, this already consumed so much, it will consume so much energy and time, cognitive energy of the respondents. And for that, I need to decide which fact concept is the most relevant and the most useful according to the literature. Of course, there are so many out there, but based on the relevant literatures, I found that both domination and mutualism is the most relevant to investigate and to explore public responses. Of course, there are different kinds. That's why the study needs to be done in different stage and different steps.
So you kept the value orientation scale simple, deliberately, because you were mainly interested in the cognition, emotions question. Is that the point you made?
Well, not exactly like that,
okay.
But not because I want to cater, because I want to integrate like cognition and emotion. Of course, the decision need to be made by having a strong argument. If we look at the umbrella of domination and mutualism, under these two big umbrella, I would say, I like to describe it like that. Under the first umbrella, domination, there are two salient beliefs, which is appropriate use and hunting. I like to focus on this umbrella because it is the issue is right there right now.
Okay.
Under this umbrella, it is very clear with the appropriate use, but also a bit question about hunting. So hunting was perceived differently in Malaysia. It was understood differently. Perhaps it could give interesting ideas how it could work, and that's what I found in this second and also fifth chapter. So it's not deliberately that I want to make it simple. It's just a matter of like, okay, there is strong argument there that the basic belief is actually, to some extent, reflecting from what I thought, reflecting salient thought about wildlife amongst Malaysians. And also I have a bit of interest to see how it works in terms of hunting and also how people use wildlife, not really use, but then consumes and in such a way. And also, yeah.
It's clear to me, and I have a final question. We still have 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay.
And at least I want to make the point. And this is about the validity of the whole approach, like the cognitive hierarchy theory. It's cognition, mental, individual. You finalize your thesis by saying that Malaysia is a collectivist society, right? So I would have been more interested, I think, when starting a research like this, in social-cultural theories about values. For example, cultural theory, practice theory, discourse theory, social representation. There are so many out there. And still you decided to choose an American individualist approach. And that really surprised me. Yeah, you have only 1 minute to respond to this, but we can do it later at the drinks, maybe.
Okay, I'll try to make it short. Of course, I also have the same dilemma in my first and second year. I looked so much and too deep about social-cultural literatures, Hofstede, Schwartz, value theories, but then it's just too much. And for me, I need to focus on one thing. And also, there is nothing that can give me a bit of ideas on how people will react to wildlife issues, other than the domination and mutualism wildlife orientation, in the more concrete ways. Of course, there are different concepts and different ideas, theories, but then also with cognitive hierarchy. But then the established foundation is there with cognitive hierarchy and wildlife orientations. I hope I answer your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Arts. And now call on the next examiner, Professor Haartsen. Professor Haartsen is professor at the Rural Geography Group of the University of Groningen. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Respected candidate, wildlife can be a sort of fascination for many people in many different ways. This applies for different types of wildlife and also for different types of geographical settings. I fully agree with you on that. You mentioned it in your introduction, and I agree. I also agree with you that the social or human aspects of wildlife relations are very relevant and that they are relatively under-researched at the moment, and especially in the non-Western part of the world. When economies develop, this aspect of wildlife conservation becomes more and more relevant, I think. So I'm very happy to see that you did your PhD research on such a relevant topic. What I particularly appreciate in this thesis is that you see it as a risk to unconditionally copy Western theoretical models on norms and values about wildlife to the Malaysian case. So you nicely try to critically, judge whether or not they work, and you nicely covered this by combining and testing the validity of the measures of these three theoretical concepts: wildlife orientations, emotions to wildlife, and risk perceptions in the Malaysian context. I'm also a researcher who very much likes empirical research, so I also very much appreciate your solid and consistent research methods and the number and different ways of your empirical data gathering. So my compliments for that. At the time I was reading your PhD thesis for the examination, that was in May this year, it was in the news that the African country of Botswana was lifting the ban on elephant hunting. Mm-hmm. The increasing human-elephant conflicts were the reason. There was especially conflicts with farmers, as you probably, no surprise, will think. That was a reason to give, again, permission to restart the hunting at elephants. And this decision caused, at that time, a lot of fuss and emotional reactions in the media and across the world, also especially in the Western world, because hunting is seen as something outdated, old-fashioned practice from a previous century. And elephants belong to the big five of very highly valued wildlife, as you know. I felt that this example in the news about Botswana nicely related to your research topic. So I enthusiastically started to read your thesis, hoping to learn much more of those examples. I knew that your thesis deals with human responses to wildlife in Malaysia, but in the field of cultural geography, where you were working in yourself, we always compare different places and countries to be able to understand and contextualize the unique differences between all these different places and countries. And that is a little bit what I miss in your thesis. Okay. Because in the introductory chapter, you give a compact overview of your research project and how it relates to existing knowledge and existing theory and existing research methods, most of them Western-oriented, but okay. However, the introduction is only embedded in the Malaysian context. A connection or a link with other South Asian countries is not or very little made, and you don't link to scientific research on wildlife nature conservation policies in these countries. I also missed the link with the African ways of dealing with wildlife because it could also have been interesting and fruitful as well. Also in your conclusion, you nicely discuss the theoretical implications of your findings and you give brief answers to the questions, which I also very much appreciate. But you do not embed your research results in other non-Western geographical contexts. And my question is, what were your reasons for not doing that? So why did you not contextualize your research in other cultural and geographical settings?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. It's kind of like a bit challenging, I would say, but then very interesting. I appreciate your question. Well, in the early stage of my study, indeed I tried to research the same kind of topic, the same kind of studies within the Southeast Asia region. Not so much. And I think I did briefly explain a little bit on the applicability of wildlife orientations, which is explained in chapter 2. I think that's the only part that I mentioned, that I tried to make a comparison of which studies conducted in Thailand. And why I did not make comparison, of course, I'm very much love to do that, except I just don't have the means to do that in terms of data. So, and I don't think it is possible for me to speculate too much because I already speculate too many things in my discussion about what's happened within the Malaysian society. So I don't think it is wise for me to also speculate across different cultures. But I'm happy to share with you that while doing this, during my PhD trajectory, I also have the opportunities to share my data, my pilot study data, with researchers from different countries. We try to integrate our data and make a comparison between 7 nations. It is unfortunately I'm not able to put it in my thesis, and the work is still working. I'm still working on it together with a couple of researchers. And also on the basis of the data, it's also quite limited for me to give a comparison. Like for example, like you said, what's happened with the lift the ban on elephant hunting in Africa. The same situation, the same context is not happening in Malaysia. There's no such thing like elephant hunting, except elephant poaching. That's there. So it is difficult for me if I try to pose that kind of question and I try to explore this question. It just doesn't make any sense because it's not happened. Of course, it happens with different species, but then not that relevant. Although there are species that are relevant, where the wildlife agencies lift the ban on crocodiles, for example, but it was happened in the state of Sarawak, which is not in the peninsular part of Malaysia. And also for your information, the cultures and how people see things are different than the people who live in peninsula and also the Sabahan and also the Sarawakians, which is the East Malaysian. So, well, because of this limitation, I decided not to make so much comparison.
Okay, thank you. My next question relates a little bit to that because it's also a geographically related issue that you more or less maybe addressed in your last part of your answer. It's about the difference between urban and rural context. Because in the Western world, a lot of people live in cities, have totally different ideas about nature and nature conservation than people live in rural areas. They more or less have what we call the wilderness idea of nature, that nature should be nice to enjoy and consume as something exotic, and you don't really use it for, functional purposes. And in your methodological descriptions, it does not really become exactly clear to me if you have mostly investigated urban human responses, or you also did a lot of rural responses to wildlife. And if it's mostly urban, my question is, does that impact the results and the conclusions of your thesis?
Yeah, thank you for such interesting question, of which I really want to share this information. Well, with survey studies, I included different kind of variables, including the demographics. And also, if you look into my thesis in chapter 5, page with the figures, page 69, you can see that from the maps, there are two different areas that I did my fieldwork. The below, the part at the below peninsula, at the southern peninsula, is actually an urban areas, where the part where I did my survey on the upper part of it is rural areas. Well, let me get back to you first with my answer to the first opponent. I mentioned that the reviewers mentioned about the importance of salient issues. So my strategy to approach my sample study is to select respondents who lives in a frequent, in an area with frequent human-wildlife interactions. So I deliberately, with intention, to avoid non-salient issues based on this question and issues. And I deliberately make it urban and rural. But unfortunately, by doing that, indirectly, I only approach the working class people. People who live in urban areas and rural areas, although they are different demographic, but then most of them coming from middle income groups. So, and also it is difficult to approach from the practical point of view. It is very difficult to approach from the higher income peoples because they live in a very different world, I would like to describe it, with the house, with all these gates and everything. And looking at my approach of mail survey is nearly impossible because in the rural areas there is no mailbox. I need to walk from one house to another. So it is just important. So one decision leads to another consequences. So it's just a matter of trade-off. And when you said about how much it will affect the results of my studies, well, it impacts a little bit, but I don't think it will be much different because from my experience and also from literatures, I can say that the notions of collectivists, how the people respond to questionnaires, the ideas, the notions of collectivists, and how people, in particular, how people respond to questionnaires, it's like ingrained in them. I can see that based on my own experience while doing fieldwork and also from my previous experience, but also from literatures. That's why I can say.
I think time-wise we have to stop, or not?
Yeah, you still have 1 or 2
I can only
minutes.
say that these might be ideas for your further research in your new position at the University of Malaysia.
I totally
so
agree.
it would be very nice that you...
I totally agree. It's just that one decision leads to another consequences, and I cannot do everything at one
No,
time.
of course, I know, I'm aware.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arjaan. We'll now continue with the third examiner, Dr. de Vries. Dr. de Vries is a senior social scientist at Wageningen Environmental Research. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Respected candidate, I also want to congratulate you with completing your PhD. I think it's very important to have more research conducted in non-Western countries and to have more cross-cultural research and comparisons. And I imagine that also the fieldwork had to be done under quite different and more trying circumstances than we are used to in the Netherlands, although it's very hot here now too. My first question is on wildlife value orientations. You say that there are two predominant wildlife value orientations, at least in Western countries: domination, reflected by underlying basic beliefs of appropriate use and hunting, on the one hand, and mutualism, characterized by social affiliation and caring beliefs. To me, this sounded very much like the two are largely mutually exclusive. You cannot score high on both at the same time. That was my original idea. However, in chapters 2 and 4, you operationalize them separately, each having its own scale. So, do you think it's possible that people score high on both values, dominance and mutualism? That's my first question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question, and my answer is yes. It is very clear that in previous literatures, that has been, of course, in Western society, there are studies that shows that people can score high both on domination and also mutualism. And it also happened in Malaysia, of which I didn't present the data in my thesis. I can see that, well, not high on both domination and mutualism. There are a small group of them, but most of them score quite neutral in their domination and mutualism's measurement. In terms of categorization, studies try to describe this group of people as pluralists, of which they are very contextual. The people that scores high on domination and mutualism, scientists describe this group of people are more pluralists. They are very contextual. Sometimes, okay, we have to protect wildlife, but on the one hand, but we also need to protect my farms.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah. On the other hand, for people who scores lower or for domination and mutualism, scientists describe this group of people as distant. So they don't have much interest in wildlife issues. I don't know. I can't really say for sure right now why that's happened for Malaysians. But of course, as you know, that there are times that because we have different kind of priorities. From if you look into the value theories about values, some people have different kind of priorities in their value system. Maybe they prioritize more about economics or about families rather than animals or environmental issues.
Okay, that's an interesting issue, the prioritization. If you have two value orientations, you can have both at the same time. Would it have been informative to look at which of both is more important to an individual, rather than just have them next to each other? To look inter-individual, within the individual, which one of the two is more important? Could it have been more informative even? So if you have to make a choice, which one do you prioritize, the domination or the mutualism?
Well, I like to focus on both, I would say. Well, it's a bit difficult because so time-consuming, and of course, it's just a matter of doing it. If I do it alone, it's of course much more very difficult, and also with the time that I have. But for me, I think I have to focus on domination and mutualism because these are the concepts, or maybe the ideology that really could give something, give ideas to wildlife managers.
Yes, sorry, I think my question is, if you look just at dominance and mutualism, would it have been interesting to have a score for an individual of which one of the two is more important?
You mean the scores for domination and between domination and mutualism?
Yeah, between those two.
Yeah, I think I'll focus on domination.
Okay, no, that's still not quite my question. Would it be interesting to have as a predictor the score on the relative importance of dominance versus mutualism, rather than to have them next to each other? So the relative importance, the relative strength of the value orientation. That's the heart of my question.
Well, I still don't get it, but can I rephrase your question? So you asked me that between domination and mutualism, which one is more important as a predictor? Is that your question, or?
No, which one is more important to the individual, and that as a predictor?
Okay. What is more important to individuals as a predictor?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think it's domination.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, to give a bit of explanation, I think because that's what being so conflicting with wildlife managers and wildlife agencies. For people who are pluralists, well, they also score high on domination, but people who don't score or maybe a bit of mutualism or distance, I would say, they don't create so much troubles, except for people who are more domination.
Okay, thank you.
I hope I answered your question. If not, perhaps we can have more discussion about this.
We can
after this, yeah,
for sure. I have a quite different question. It's about emotions.
Okay.
In chapter 5, I think it say, from an evolutionary perspective, emotions are described as being innate, functioning as an effective adaptive mechanism that promote human survival and well-being. Explicit knowledge and learning processes are not needed. And I'm a little bit confused giving this statement about how you operationalize the concept of the valence of emotion in terms of liking or disliking, of finding animals pleasurable or not pleasurable, for a list of number of 15, 12, I don't know exactly how many animals you asked the question. But this question about finding it pleasant or unpleasant, to me it could also be construed as your attitude towards animals in general. And when I think of attitudes, I think there's a large cognitive component involved in attitudes. And you give an example as a negative emotional reaction towards rabbits of farmers because they eat crops. I think that makes perfect sense from a cognitive, rational perspective too. So, do you think your operationalization of the balance of emotions is optimal in retrospect, or would you have preferred to do it somewhat differently in hindsight?
Thank you for your question. I think my measurement, the way that I measured is optimal. It is because it's actually, I'm not exactly measure only 12 species, but a long list of animals, 56 of animals. Based on the literatures, there are studies that only measure how do you feel pleasant or pleasant to wildlife, only wildlife. So in my case, in my study, I know there are issues like, okay, this is probably just like an attitude measure, not really reflecting a valence or core effect or the liking or disliking. In order to counter such issues, so I try to have a long list of animals to really have an abstract ideas how did they feel pleasant or unpleasant towards animals. So from the long list of animals, I can calculate the means and also how it will, how can I construct the concept of valence, the variable of valence.
Okay, yeah. I understand that using the long list of animals makes it very abstract, generalizable, the mean score, but I still, what would you say to someone who used the exact same scale and said it was an attitude measurement of how you think about animals in general?
No, well, I don't think so. I don't think it. There is some. I know that from attitude concept, attitude theory, there are different components like cognitive, affective, and also behaviors. Part of a component of attitudes. If you look from the affective, of course, it is resembled to some degree, but I also doubt that it is very similar. Have very strong similarities between these two measurements, because for attitude, normally it's a bit contextual. You have to, like for example, it is, I don't think in attitude measure you just simply ask how do you feel pleasant to wildlife. You need to be a bit specific, or how do you feel pleasant or unpleasant to animals at your backyard. Or birds at your backyard. So that's more like an attitude measure. For balance, it's more very basic and very simple questions. How do you feel pleasant or unpleasant to these animals?
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Vries. And I'll call on the last examiner, Dr. Elans. Dr. Elans is Assistant Professor at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group. Please.
Thank you. Respected candidate, like my colleagues, I would like to first congratulate you with your interesting thesis, especially because it's taking place in Malaysia, a country which I'm not that familiar. And I especially like how you have investigated the relationships between lay people and wildlife by means of the wildlife value orientations, a concept widely used all over the world. My first question originates from Professor Harry Wells, so who would originally be one of your opponents.
Yeah.
I will shortly summarize his question. There's a lot of specific research being done on what you could refer to as non-human co-inhabitants, as some tend to refer to wildlife and animals these days. And all this research combined comes with a result that seems to be leading to a revolution, a true paradigm shift in our thinking about animals. It has become scientifically clear by now that we as humans do not differ so much in kind from animals, but only in degree. What humans and animals mostly share is sentience or consciousness. Quantitative and qualitative scientific research is coming almost daily with new and more evidence substantiating this conclusion. Where we could first prove sentience in fellow mammals, it's now found across the species spectrum, from fish to birds to amphibians and insects, and scientific evidence around it is still growing. It can be argued that studies in human-animal relations have traditionally tended to favor the human side of the relation without giving much voice to the animals. Given the advancements in science I just outlined, human-animal relation studies can actually no longer allow themselves this unilateral, one-dimensional focus on humans anymore. If we have to acknowledge, because of this overwhelming scientific evidence, that we only differ from animals in degree, should human-animal relations studies not allow them as much voice and agency as they gave to human voices and agency? And now my question is, in your thesis, you used the traditional human-centeredness in your approach to human-animal relations. My concrete question and challenge to you today is, if you study this relationship like you do, and relationships always involve two sides, shouldn't you give the scientific evidence I referred to earlier have given much more attention to both sides of this relationship? And should you not have given much more voice to the animal side of the equation in human-animal relation studies and have come to conclusion based on these combined sentient voices?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I think it is a very interesting question and also a big debate. From my point of view, I think it is such a debate that people who works on social science in what path that you want to choose. To have such integration, to have the voice of wildlife and also as an agency to better understand, included in my thesis, of course it will be very interesting. But then in my case, it will be totally different. I have to make such like interdisciplinary studies. Well, it is just impossible to do that, although I know it can contribute something to it, but then focusing on what, from the psychological perspective, this is what I found, and if I want to do something, perhaps, of course, it will be a new motivation for me to do that. And without no doubt, of course, it will contribute different ideas and different understandings, and I agree with that. But then, as I said, from practical point of views, this is what I can do.
Yes, but if you think about what would be possible if you would have given animals more agency, more voice, how do you think that would have changed your research results or outcomes?
I would say yes. I think it will change a little bit. The way that, yes, like right now, I'm only focusing on how public respond to like lethal control. But I don't investigate how animal will react to such question, to such issues, looking at their behavior and everything. So, of course, it will change a little bit if I look, do some animals' behavior studies, that kind of thing, or maybe look from constructivist or a different paradigm of research and see from the perspective of wildlife. Of course, I think it will be different a little bit, but I doubt it will be different that much, because what determines our action is the humans itself. There are tons of studies saying that there are many factors. We can say that there are many factors that shows changes, environmental changes, but then the main important factors are humans. So I think the most important factor are us. That's why I studied and focused on this.
Okay, thank you.
I hope I answered your question.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Then I would like to continue to the wildlife value orientation scale. So in chapter 2, we have discussed it before already, you studied the applicability of the wildlife value orientation skills within the Malaysian context. And then your results indicated that the hunting beliefs as part of the domination construct it's two-dimensional. One is relating to consequences of hunting for wildlife, and another one relating to hunting opportunities for humans. And you also conclude on page 23 that the current domination scale is not optimal to capture those hunting beliefs in the Malaysian context. In chapter 3, you continue with qualitative research regarding human-wildlife interactions, and you come up with 6 basic beliefs about the way people interact and with wildlife. And then after chapter 3, I was really expecting in chapter 4 that you would continue, that you would merge both chapters into a revised WVO scale, and in which you have adapted then the original scale based upon your interview results. And I was really surprised to read that you just continued with the original scale. Mm-hmm. Why was that? Can you explain that? And secondly, if you were now asked to adapt this skill, the wildlife orientation skills, to better reflect the results of your interviews, what would you change and why?
Thank you for your question. As I said, this is a very to the earlier opponent. This is an important issue of which I already have a bit of ideas. Perhaps it will be a new agenda in my future research. First of all, in my second chapter, I found that it is have a bit of like less optimal reliability, and they are two-dimensional. And in the second studies about exploratory, there are 6 teams. But if I try to relate these 2 findings, it is very difficult for me to like try to create something, a new concepts, like because most of the respondents only focus on issues of respect and religious, and it doesn't really belong to any of domination and mutualism. And that's how I decided to stick with...
But I read in chapter 3 that the respect belief was related to appropriate use. So it said it had something additional for the domination skill.
But in terms of meaning, to some degree, it also reflects... That's why in the graph, if you can see in my presentation, I put it somewhere in between domination and mutualism because it reflects both. It can't, because when I ask them, if you feel have this, if you have a certain degree of this one, will you accept a certain kind of management action like lateral control with the follow-up questions? But it didn't show like that, so it's somewhere in between. And I think between these 2 umbrellas, perhaps this is just my speculation and just my hypothesis, probably there are new umbrellas that could give more description about hunting. Unfortunately, in my study, it's not really focused on hunting, and it's about how people react to wildlife in general, and it's not really about particular things of hunting. So that's why I did not give too much focus on the distinction between hunting between the Western and also Western. But I do have a bit of intention to see whether the 2 dimensions of hunting beliefs, how much it could predict the variables that I will investigate in the 4th and 5th chapter. And unfortunately, it also didn't explain anything. So that's quite unfortunate for me. And of course, yeah, future research need to focus on this one if you really want to see, if you really want to see what are the new value orientation perhaps, or what are the clear beliefs about it, about hunting, perhaps research should focus on that rather than general human-animal interactions.
Okay, let's see. Okay, I will continue with my final question, and that relates to proposition 3. So I would like one of the paranymphs to read out proposition number 3.
Proposition number 3.
If people want to save the world from environmental degradation, ecotourism is not the answer.
Thank you. This is, of course, a very intriguing statement, as it's often argued that ecotourism can be considered as an important saver, rescuer of biodiversity in a given area. And even within your own group, the Culture Geography group, of course, many PhD students have argued in favor of it. My question is, I have 2 questions for you regarding this proposition. Could you explain this proposition for me a bit further? And secondly, when I was reading about in your curriculum vitae on page 119, I read that after your graduation you will rejoin the Department of Recreation and Ecotourism at the University Putra, Malaysia. So I'm very much looking forward to hear how this proposition, as well as how your study results, will influence your research and education efforts in your future career again.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. This is such not only challenging questions for me to answer, but also a very challenging question for us, every one of us, to answer. Because looking at the current environmental changes, it is too drastic. It is just impossible to do one simple thing in a very short moment. I think most of us could agree that with ecotourism, it needs a bit of time to improve environmental degradation. A more drastic approach like, okay, lifting or ban entering national parks. Of course, it will improve environmental degradation or forest exploitation quickly, but then with ecotourism, it will take some time. So it's not that I overly did not agree with this idea.
Could you please finish your sentence?
Thank you. It's not that I'm totally disagree with this idea, it's that it is very challenging for us to only rely on ecotourism. We have to also merge with different kind of fields and also disciplines from scientific point of view and also from management practices. We need to engage with each other. We cannot rely on one approach to really improve environmental degradation because it is too drastic. As you can see, I like to share what's happened in Malaysia, floods, rain. In fact, this environmental disaster has become a big threat to ecotourism. And how can we do ecotourism activities if we cannot do anything? If the place is closed because of the weathers and everything. So it's just too drastic.
That is a sentence with too many semicolons. Thank you very much. Dr. Elan, thank you very much. I adjourn the meeting. The examining committee will now withdraw for consultation. Please be seated. I hereby reopen this meeting. The committee has reached a decision, and I'm going to read it to you. The Academic Board of Wageningen University, represented by the Deputy Rector Magnificus and 6 committee members appointed by the Academic Board, having noted the content of a thesis entitled Understanding Human Responses to Wildlife in Malaysia, with propositions, and having heard the defense of that thesis, has decided to confer the degree of doctor on Zulkhairi Azizi Zainal Abidin, born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, on December the 19th of the year 1985, and to grant him all rights and privileges ensuing from the doctorate by law and custom. The Academic Board assumes that you accept your duty as a scientist to execute your future research ethically and with due diligence, according to the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. Now I invite the promoter, Professor Dr. van der Duim, to acquit himself of his duty. Please.
You've heard the decision of the Academic Board of Wageningen University to confer on you, Zulkhairi Azizi Zainal Abidin, the degree of doctor. It's now my honor to present you with a degree signed by the Rector Magnificus and the promoters and sealed with the Great Seal of Wageningen University. I first now invite you to sign the degree as well, and with this signature, you declare to act according to the scientific code of conduct in the future. Allow me, Rector Magnificus, to offer my congratulations, dear Doctor, dear Zul. Also on behalf of Maarten Jacobs, I would like to congratulate you with this interesting and challenging thesis on human responses to wildlife in Malaysia. I would also like to congratulate your wife, your children. Hopefully they will watch Word TV and will be part in this way in the ceremony. I would also like to thank Dr. Maarten Jacobs for his excellent daily supervision of this research project. Your thesis makes a new contribution to the discussion on this topic by combining concepts such as wildlife value orientations, risk perceptions, emotions in an overarching framework, and applying these concepts in an empirical research in a non-Western context. And I think the latter is also something which is acknowledged by the committee doing this research in another research context, which is really one of the merits of your thesis, which is found by the committee as a very interesting thesis, but also maybe with a little lack of reflection at the end. But we have been discussing that many times. There were also the opinion that you defended your thesis in a lively way, answering the questions, sometimes also in a rather pragmatic way, but that is also part of it. Before I give the floor to Dr. Maarten Jacobs to add a personal address, I would like to thank you for being part of our GEO community. Your stay at Wageningen has not only contributed to GEO as a scientific community, but also to the atmosphere in the group. I think I speak on behalf of all of us also present today to thank you for being such a nice and considerate colleague. And now I'd like to invite Maarten Jacobs to add a personal address.
Respected Dr. Zainal Abidin, dear Zul, congratulations with this great achievement. You are such a nice guy. That was my first impression when meeting you a bit over 4 years ago. And I learned that I'm far from unique believing this. Dozens of times, literally, colleagues came to me after they met you for the first time just to say, he's such a nice guy, with a smile on their face. Not only they find you nice, they find you so nice that they felt an urgent need to express it. So it seems that you have these little invisible packages of happiness or joy that you distribute secretly on a perpetual basis, making people always feel a little bit better after having talked with you than before. As Rene said, we have enjoyed you being around for a couple of years. I also believe you have enjoyed being around. You have participated enthusiastically in chair group activities, sometimes organized them. You were one of the key figures in the vivid and engaged PhD community at our chair group. Not only by your presence, but also by just who you are. Always in for a talk, carefully listen to the other and responding very kindly. You immersed yourself in the diversity within our group, with people using different theories and different methods, sometimes very different, But we have learned that there is at least one thing that binds all of us. We all find you such a nice guy. I think it's fair to say, on behalf of my colleagues, that we will miss you. And for sure, I will miss you. I will miss the sometimes short and oftentimes lengthy conversations we had, in which we also shared what keeps our mind busy. The beautiful things, but also the sad things in life. And yes, sometimes we even talked about research a bit. When I thought about the 4 years you have been spending on your research with us, the first thing that came to my mind was, Lukter et emergo. That is the motto of the Dutch province called Zeeland, which you visited early during your stay. And it translates into, I struggle and I emerge. Struggling is perfectly normal for PhD, right? If a candidate would not struggle, then my first question would be, so what's wrong then with your project? But in your case, the struggle was much more fundamental. You were confronted with a series of sad events during those 4 years. The serious disease of your mother, the flooding of your brother's business, and the tragic death of your father. And so, oftentimes, you went back to Malaysia to support your family because you're a real family man. Fortunately, also happy things occurred in those 4 years, and the most noteworthy one is the birth of your daughter. But also then, it took you time. You had to go back to Malaysia, wait for a visa to come back with your complete family, including the precious newborn. Amidst all of this, you have always worked with full devotion, giving it your best shot every day, leaving me puzzled. How on earth is this possible? When did you sleep? I still wonder. Your absolute commitment also made you struggle, always trying new data analysis strategies, always trying to improve draft versions of your papers. You were never satisfied and continuous looking for ways to improve your work. Perhaps it's good to think back now of where you were when you started and where you are now, and appreciate the very, very steep learning curve that you have shown. The struggle also referred to events that happened during your data collection. No matter how beautiful your study design, reality just presents raw edges. One story, one day you wrote that big, aggressive dogs were chasing you when you were targeting one street for data collection. And you wondered if compromising your sampling design a bit would be acceptable, even. We concluded that being eaten by dogs is perhaps not a good idea. If you was not such a nice guy, okay, fair enough, but not you. You faced all of this not alone. The greatest support came from your family, I believe. Your wife, Lini, she's watching, hi Lini, has done everything she could to help you focusing on your research. So Lini, I wish to thank you for that and also congratulate you. I was happy to hear from Zul that you are now taking more time for yourself, and I think you are deserving that so much. Also, congratulations to your son Adam and your daughter Zaria. Congratulations with such a brilliant father. Daddy is coming home soon, and the plan this time is that he stays. Lukter et emergo. This struggle has ended today, and now you emerge as doctor. And you're still such a nice guy. Congratulations, we go celebrate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs and Professor van der Duim. Dr. Zainal Abidin, also on behalf of the academic board, I would like to congratulate you with your newly acquired title, and also would like to include your family and friends either present here or watching this through TV in those congratulations. And you have earned that title on the basis of your thesis, but also on the basis of the defense this afternoon in front of a highly qualified committee. Actually, I really enjoyed the debate that was here today on the subtlety of all these scales of domination, or on your assembling strategy, on what are actually emotions, or how should we interpret human-animal relationships, and even can people score differently or high on different scales, and yet can you interpret that properly? I would like to thank you very much for selecting Wageningen University as the alma mater for your final training as an independent researcher. I wish you a lot of success in your future career when you go back to university and will teach. And I also wish you a lot of pleasure in celebrating your new dignity today with family and friends. And finally, I would like to thank our examiners. It is highly appreciated that you took the trouble of evaluating the thesis and, asking questions during this ceremony, in that way guaranteeing the quality of the thesis of Wageningen University. And I also would like to thank the audience for being present here and to watch how this candidate would perform. And this marks the end of the ceremony. Once more, thank you all for being present here, and I close this ceremony.